Okay, let's start with a phrase that sounds, almost deceptively simple. God remembered. I
Hmm.
mean, think about that for a second. We're talking about an omniscient, eternal being. So what does it even mean for a being like that to remember something? Does that mean he forgot for a little while?
That's the perfect question to get us started on this deep dive, because we're looking at these huge biblical stories and the theology that grew out of them.
Specifically, God's active role.
Exactly. His active involvement and how that forced people for centuries to try and draw these really, really careful lines between what is divine and what is human.
And our source material for this is kind of twofold. We're looking at that literary pattern God remembered, but also pairing it with the history of Christian doctrine itself.
Right. We're going from, ancient, strange controversies like the Nephilim all the way to the super precise definition of Christ.
So the mission here is to pull out the active meaning from these simple-sounding phrases.
And to see how those early arguments, those fights over what was divine and what wasn't, really built the foundations for centuries of theology. For you, the listener, it's like a look under the hood.
All right, let's start there then. God remembered.
Yeah, in the Bible's literature, this phrase is absolutely not about God having a lapse in memory.
Yeah.
It's a literary device, a really powerful one.
It's a signal.
It's a signal, yes. It tells the reader that a huge shift is coming. God is about to proactively intervene. He's moving from, let's say, an observer to an actor.
And the biggest, most dramatic example of that has to be the flood story with Noah.
Oh, absolutely. The context right before that phrase in Genesis is just bleak. The world is full of violence, corruption. God is heartbroken, and Noah is just floating on these dark, chaotic waters. It's basically a state of decreation.
Everything's being undone, and just when it seems like total abandonment.
That's when you get the phrase, God remembered Noah.
And that's the pivot point.
It is the theological hinge of the entire story. It's not just a thought. It's a declaration of commitment. The narrative shifts right there from decreation back toward recreation. The waters stop, and the healing begins.
What's so interesting is how that idea, that active memory, carries all the way into the New Testament. It's central to the Messiah's arrival.
It is. You see it right away in the Gospel of Luke. Take Zechariah. His name literally means God remembered.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And when he gives his prophecy, he says the Messiah is coming specifically because God is remembering his covenant, the promise he made to Abraham. Mary says almost the same thing, that God is remembering his mercy.
So the idea isn't just that God is out there somewhere, but that he is actively, relationally involved in healing the world. But you also mentioned something in the notes about us becoming co-rememberers. What's that about?
Well, if God's identity is tied to this act of remembering his promises, then human worship is often framed as our act of remembering too.
Like celebrating Passover or the Eucharist.
Exactly. When we do those things, we're not just recalling a past event. We're actively placing ourselves back into that covenant story. We're participating in God's redemptive work. We become, in a way, co-rememberers with God.
That's a powerful idea, that shift from chaos to active recreation. But it also, immediately brings up the question of boundaries. What happens when the divine and the human interact in, let's say, unauthorized ways? Which leads us right back to the chaos before the flood. Genesis 6, the whole conundrum of the Nephilim.
Yes.
Yeah.
Genesis 6.4, the passage that's given theologians headaches for thousands of years. It says, the sons of God mingled with the daughters of Adam, and they produced the Nephilim, the mighty ones, the men of renown.
A catastrophic mixing.
A total breakdown of boundaries. And the first problem is, who exactly were these sons of God? Because the answer to that changes everything.
And the research points to two main camps, right?
Two main interpretations. The first one is the angelic or spiritual view. This is the really ancient one, and it's pretty dramatic. It says the sons of God were literally disobedient angels.
Spiritual beings who took on human form.
Right. They abandoned their proper place, came to earth, and had these unnatural relationships with human women.
Which would make the Nephilim these unauthorized, powerful hybrids. You see that idea all over the place in non-biblical texts from that time, too, like the Book of Enoch.
Absolutely. Those texts paint them as these giant tyrants, bullies who filled the world with the wickedness that, ultimately led to the flood.
Okay, so that's the supernatural view. What's the other one?
The other camp is the human or royal view. It's much more, let's say, sociological.
Less supernatural.
Way less. It argues the sons of God were just powerful human men, maybe kings, aristocrats, or even from the righteous family line of Seth. Yeah.
And
they started marrying outside their own godly lineage.
So it's a mixing of righteous and unrighteous lines.
Exactly. And that union created a new class of powerful, tyrannical rulers, which, by the way, fits perfectly with the Hebrew word used there, Yeborim, which just means mighty ones.
So either way, the result is a powerful, oppressive race that corrupted everything. Let's talk about their size, because the name itself, Nephilim, is debated.
It's a great linguistic puzzle. The Hebrew root is nephal, which means to fall. So Nephilim could mean the fallen ones.
But that's not how it was always translated.
No. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, translates Nephilim as gigantes.
Giants.
Giants. And that translation had a huge influence on early Christians. It really cemented the idea that these were beings of, extraordinary, even monstrous size.
And the Bible does have other references to giants later on, which seems to support that. You've got King Og of Bashan.
Og, yes. Deuteronomy says his bed was made of iron and was over 13 feet long. And then there's the most famous one, Goliath. And depending on which ancient text you read, he was either a shocking 6'9" or an unbelievable 9'9". Either way, the point is clear. These people had a reputation for being huge.
Okay, but here's the part that creates the real theological mess. The Nephilim show up again after the flood.
The ultimate plot hole.
Genesis is very clear that the flood wiped out everything and everyone not on the ark. But then in the book of Numbers, the Israelite spies say they saw Nephilim in the Promised Land. So how did they survive?
That's the million-dollar question. It forces you to rethink what the word means. Was Nephilim just a term that got applied to any group of giant, tyrannical people?
So the condition survived, not the specific people.
That's one theory. The other, more speculative idea is that somehow the genetic line was preserved on the ark.
Yeah.
Maybe through one of Noah's daughters-in-law. We just don't know.
It's one of those classic biblical passages that just, raises more questions than it answers. I saw a note about some wilder theories trying to connect them to Greek myths or even Neanderthals.
Oh, yeah. The parallels to the Greek Titans were made even in ancient times, another race of powerful, chaotic hybrids. And yes, more recently, some have speculated that the stories of the Nephilim could be a kind of distorted cultural memory of early Homo sapiens encountering Neanderthals.
Because Neanderthals were more robust, more powerful looking.
Exactly. To an early human, they might have seemed like supermen. The timeline is a bit tricky to make that work, but it's a fascinating idea. But what really matters here, for our discussion, is how this whole chaotic story of unauthorized mixing creates this intense pressure to define boundaries. And that pressure is what drives the development of Christian doctrine.
That's the perfect transition. So we have God actively intervening in the world, and then we have this story of a catastrophic, unauthorized intervention. So let's jump forward now to the early church. They had to define the one single, ultimate, authorized mingling of the divine and human.
The person of Christ.
Yes.
And that necessity to define him is everything. The theological and philosophical tension around defining that very specific God-man boundary pushed the early church into some incredibly rigorous thinking.
For Christianity, all other questions, even about the kingdom of God, seem to take a backseat to one question.
Who is Jesus? That's it. And you can see them wrestling with it from the very beginning. Paul's letters, some of our earliest documents, already show what scholars call a high Christology.
Meaning a view of Christ as divine.
As an exalted divine figure sitting at the right hand of God. And then the Gospel of John just solidified a very low Christology. For them, Jesus was a righteous man, a prophet, specially chosen by God. But he wasn't divine. He wasn't the eternal Son of God. His greatness came from his perfect obedience to the law of Moses.
So you have these competing ideas floating around. The Orthodox conclusion, which took centuries to hammer out, ended up as two core doctrines: the Trinity and the Incarnation.
Right. The Trinity is complex, but Augustine defined it pretty simply. The Father, Son, and Spirit are each God. They are distinct from one another, but there is only one God. But the Incarnation, that was even more complicated.
That was the doctrine that defined Christ as being, what was the phrase, of the same essence with the Father, but also born of the Virgin Mary and made human.
Exactly. And that's why figures like Cyril of Alexandria fought so hard for the title Theotokos for Mary, God bearers. It was a way to insist that the baby she bore was fully divine from the very moment of his conception.
The final definitive statement came at the Council of Chalcedon in 451.
The absolute defining moment. That's where they affirmed that Christ has two distinct natures, one divine, one human, and that these two natures exist together in one single person.
And the language they used was so incredibly specific, so restrictive. They used 4 negative phrases to describe it. Why? What were they so worried about?
They were trying to prevent the very kind of messy, chaotic mixing we see in the Nephilim story from defining Christ. Each of those 4 negatives, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation, was a firewall against a specific heresy.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Without confusion was aimed at a teaching that Christ's divine nature basically swallowed up his human one, creating some kind of third new hybrid thing. And without separation was aimed at the idea that Jesus was really 2 different persons, a human one and a divine one, just sort of morally linked.
So that dense theological language was the church building a very strong fence.
A fortress. They were drawing a hard line in the sand to say, this is the one pure authorized way the divine and human meet, and it is nothing like the chaos of Genesis 6.
And this need for clarity, for purity, is really what gives birth to the whole concept of doctrine. And its opposite, heresy.
That's right. Christianity basically invents the idea of religious doctrine because for them, salvation depended on believing the right truth about Jesus. Doctrina, just means teaching, and it had to be based on orthodoxy, right belief, and right worship.
And if you have right belief, you automatically create wrong belief.
You create heresy. A teaching that someone actively chooses, that's what the word means, a choice, that threatens the core truth. And the biggest early alternative was Gnosticism.
From the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge.
Exactly. And they had a totally different worldview.
Yeah.
For them, the physical world, all matter, was fundamentally evil, a prison.
So salvation wasn't about faith, it was about secret knowledge.
Secret knowledge, gnosis, that your spirit didn't belong here, that it came from a higher spiritual realm. They completely rejected the Old Testament. They saw the Creator God, Yahweh, as an ignorant or even evil lesser power who's trying to trap spirits and bodies.
And if matter is evil, that has huge implications for how they saw Jesus.
It changes everything. It leads to a view called docetism. If the body is an evil prison, then the divine Savior couldn't possibly have had a real one.
So his body was just an illusion, a ghost.
A phantom, an appearance. He only seemed to be human. And of course, the mainstream church rejected this completely because it denies the single most important event, the incarnation, the belief that God truly became flesh.
This whole drive for doctrinal purity, for drawing boundaries, it just keeps going right through the Reformation. You can almost map it out on a spectrum.
You absolutely can. Just look at the arguments over sacraments in the church. On one end, what you might call the low church, or the left wing of the Reformation.
The Anabaptists.
The Anabaptists. They took the really radical step of rejecting infant baptism entirely. They insisted that only an adult believer could be baptized, and that baptism had to be a pure act of a pure church.
And that wasn't just a small theological tweak. Rejecting infant baptism in the 1500s was like rejecting your citizenship. It meant rejecting the entire idea of a state church. It was a statement of radical purity.
It was. And then on the other end, the high church or right wing, you have groups like the Lutherans and Catholics. They held on to a much stronger sacramental theology. They believed God really actively uses physical things, water, bread, wine, as instruments of grace.
Like Luther's view of the Eucharist.
Exactly. He taught that Christ's body and blood are truly present in, with, and under the bread and wine. That's a very powerful statement about the divine being present right here in the physical world.
So it's this constant push and pull, this quest to define where God acts and what counts as pure, whether it's the nature of Christ or the rituals of the church. It's the engine of the whole story.
It really brings us full circle. We started with God's active memory, his decision to intervene. Then we saw the chaos of the Nephilim, where that divine-human interaction was unauthorized and destructive.
And then we saw how that tension forced Christian thinkers to use intense critical reasoning to define Christ, to set those fixed doctrines at Chalcedon. It seems like the biggest mysteries are always about defining the boundaries of God's engagement with us.
Which means theology isn't just an academic game. It's a necessary response to spiritual chaos. But the material also reminds us that for all this commitment to strict reason and doctrine, there's always a countercurrent.
The search for direct experience.
The search for an immediate personal experience of the divine. You hear it called the religion of the heart.
Like the Pietist movement, which was a reaction against what they saw as cold, dead, rational theology. They wanted a faith they could feel.
Absolutely. From ancient mysticism to modern revivalism, there's always this impulse to find God inwardly, to have a direct encounter that, sometimes exists in tension with all the complicated formulas of Chalcedon.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We started with the chaos of the Nephilim, this unauthorized mixing, which forced the church to create these incredibly rigid boundaries in their doctrines.
Hmm.
So, is that religion of the heart, that search for immediate spiritual experience, just an inevitable reaction, a pendulum swing away from all that rigid definition? Or is that rational doctrine necessary to keep our focus clear, to prevent us from falling back into some kind of chaotic, unauthorized spiritual mixing? Where do you draw the line between reason and experience? That's your deep dive for today.